I would love to start by looking at the history of vaccines. Many people champion the vaccines of today by repeating the popular claim that vaccines have saved millions of lives and eradicated many dangerous diseases of our world. So, is this claim actually true?
Really, when you look at the graphs of the death rate from the various so-called vaccine preventable diseases, it's very, very clear that vaccines came in at late stages. And in the case of, say, scarlet fever, which was a major cause of death particularly in industrial cities, there was never any vaccine that was introduced for scarlet fever, and yet we see the same decline in death rate. So let's take a look at some of these graphs. And so I mentioned before scarlet fever, and you can see the incidence of scarlet fever here, and down here is smallpox. And you can see that generally speaking, where there are spikes of deaths from scarlet fever, there are also spikes of deaths from smallpox, which should tell you something that, there were times when diseases became more rampant in certain circumstances. And again, this was happening at a time when people were leaving rural areas, they were packing into these overcrowded cities, they had dirty water, sewage running through the streets, they had very poor food security, there was starvation, there was malnutrition. And you can also see here where the various pieces of legislation to make smallpox vaccination compulsory were passed, and particularly here, where a more stringent vaccination law was passed in 1867, and then there's this huge spike in smallpox cases. Okay, so that's smallpox, which is one of the ones that's talked about most often. And so this measles is represented here in green. You can see a lot of people died of measles in the 19th century, and then measles deaths virtually disappeared. So by the time the measles vaccine was introduced, this is in the US in 1968, the death rate from measles was virtually zero anyway. Now, scarlet fever, once again in red here, and you can see that scarlet fever deaths were disappearing at much the same time in history as measles deaths, again, without a vaccine. And of course, whooping cough or pertussis is in yellow here. And this is the point at which the whooping cough vaccine is introduced. So it's actually plumbers and sanitation engineers, and I suppose you could say also the invention of electricity, which gave us refrigeration and therefore reliable food storage. So that's the explanation for the decline of deaths from infectious diseases, along with women getting more educated, having fewer children, and generally just there being less poverty and greater wealth, so that people weren't living in squalor. That's what we have to thank for the decline of deaths due to infectious disease. Vaccination played a very small role in it, if indeed it could be argued that it played a role at all. And I am personally of the opinion that it did not.